epic wonders, the friendly faces, and incredible new adventures that will change you and the way you see the world. Right here in Queensland.
Hello and welcome to World Science Festival Brisbane 2021's panel Mind Altering Medicines. I'm your host Teagan Taylor. I'd like to start today's panel by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land we meet, the Yagara and Turrbal tribes here in Brisbane, and the traditional owners and elders past, present and emerging for all the lands where we're meeting and streaming and watching today. So before we delve into the minds of our panellists, who are very smart and have lots of interesting things to say, let's set the scene with a video that traces the short history of psychedelics in medicine.
Humans have been using plants and fungus to change the experience of consciousness for a very long time.
9,000-year-old cave paintings depict rituals with psychedelic mushrooms.
Psychedelics were often used in religious ceremonies as sacraments for divination and healing.
It wasn't until the mid-20th century that science got with the program. Early psychedelics research transformed neuroscience.
We began treating 5 patients for 26 days.
In clinical trials, psychedelics like LSD showed extraordinary potential.
It's an important drug in treatment of mental and emotional disorder.
These substances rose from obscurity to miraculous promise in a matter of years.
Dangerous and deadly.
Disastrous consequences.
All of a sudden, there are these scare stories in the media.
Bizarre fatal accident. Permanent brain damage.
Hyped by the government. There's propaganda.
Suicide.
Chromosomal abnormality.
Psychedelics were soon perceived as a threat to public safety and global stability.
It's a very dangerous drug.
President Nixon went to the Narcotics Bureau today to sign a drug bill.
And by the early 70s, essentially the research has stopped.
The golden age of psychedelic science was over. But this story began in 1943.
A young Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann is working at a pharmaceutical company in Switzerland.
Tasked with formulating a new stimulant, Hofmann quite inadvertently opened Pandora's box.
He accidentally ingests what they called LSD-25, got it on his finger, maybe in his eye, and started feeling strange. He realized there's something psychoactive in this one.
3 days later, he ingested some intentionally.
And realizes like, oh shit, I'm losing it. Hofmann was having the first acid trip in the world. So he and his lab assistant take one of the most famous bicycle rides in history to his house, where he is separating from his body, he's seeing himself from the ceiling. Then he stepped out in his garden and everything looked jeweled with dew as if it were the first day of creation. And that is how LSD was discovered. Commemorated on April 19th as Bicycle Day.
Sandoz, the company Hofmann worked for, provided LSD-25 for free to scientists around the world.
They basically unleashed this open source research effort where they offered huge amounts of it to any researcher, basically with a nice piece of stationery.
I could feel with my eyes.
It was LSD that catalyzed our understanding of neurotransmitters and receptors, and also the development of other psychiatric drugs.
Clinical researchers investigated LSD as a treatment for a wide range of mental illnesses.
They looked at obsession, anxiety, depression. They looked especially at alcoholism and had a 50% success rate, which is quite remarkable.
Psychedelics became a standard tool in psychotherapy.
It would help people speed the process of bringing their subconscious to where you could discuss it with your therapist. There was a lot of this going on in the 50s.
There was a dark side to the research as well. Both the military and the CIA saw great potential.
The squad on drugs with LSD.
The CIA got very interested. At first they thought LSD might be a mind control agent or a truth serum. And then they thought, well, let's weaponize it. Let's put it in the water supply. Let's secretly give it to foreign leaders to make them do and say stupid things. So it was one crazy idea after another. Awful, awful stuff.
But it's what was happening on the street that doomed this research.
The drugs escaped the laboratory. And then Timothy Leary gives it a big push.
Harvard psychologist Timothy Leary developed a dubious curriculum of mind expansion and personal truth through psychedelics.
A scandal erupts. He's fired from Harvard and then decides to become the LSD evangelist.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
He's essentially saying everybody should use this drug. And Richard Nixon was convinced that he was dealing with the threat from psychedelics. The most dangerous man in America.
The kids who take LSD aren't going to fight your wars. They're not going to join your corporation.
And here, Timothy Leary and Richard Nixon were in agreement.
So Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and that listed psilocybin and LSD as no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, neither of which are true. And that's a remarkable event in the history of science. I don't know that you can point to another time or episode where you had a very promising line of inquiry that is simply stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with the science. And we lost 30 years of research. Imagine what we would know now had we been studying these compounds for those 30 years. What we might have learned about depression, anxiety and addiction, consciousness, and how the mind works.
Thank you to Michael Pollan and World Science Festival New York for that piece about the history of psychedelic discovery and research. So it's time to meet our panel now. May I introduce Matthew Johnson, one of the world's leading scientists on the effects of psychedelics, Paul Lignaitsky, a principal investigator across a number of Australia's first clinical psychedelic trials, Margaret Ross, who is in charge of an Australian first clinical trial of psilocybin, and finally, Olivia Carter, who researches the brain's natural chemicals and an individual's conscious experience. So the word psychedelic derives from two Greek words, psyche, meaning the soul or mind, and delune, meaning to make visible or reveal. And so that seems like a pretty good introduction to this class of chemicals. Paul, most people will have heard of LSD or magic mushrooms, but what actually makes a drug a psychedelic?
Yeah, so psychedelics are a fascinating class of substances that produce perhaps the most dramatic and influential and interesting subjective effects than any other class of drug. The classical psychedelics primarily act through the serotonergic system, through one particular receptor subtype, in fact, and they have effects on subjective state that really are quite remarkable. They affect every level of processing, from cognition to affect to perception. It's important to note that what we're talking about when we talk about psychedelic medicine is not the simple chemical activity of a class of molecules in the brain. It's in fact, I would argue, the most powerful level at which to try to understand what's happening, and perhaps the key way these drugs work is by looking at the kinds of subjective experiences people have. And we can get into that soon. So crucially, the way that this treatment is delivered is not so much as a chemotherapeutic, as a simple drug. It's a combination of drug and talk therapy within a conducive environment, and specific forms of psychotherapeutic preparation prior to the drug and integration thereafter.
So, Margaret, you're running or involved in this first Australian trial of psilocybin, which is the active chemical in magic mushrooms. Can you tell us about how it came about?
Sure. So I was working as a psychologist with people who are terminally ill and their families, and obviously the enormous grief and anxiety and depression that can come along with that. And we found that many people were, while they were responding to perhaps traditional talking therapies and usual medications like antidepressant or anti-anxiety medications, there was actually quite a number of people that remained really quite terrified and withdrawn, and approached the end of their life really quite quite immobilised by suffering. So I was certainly looking for emerging and novel treatments in this space, and I'd heard about Matt's work with Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University and NYU, where they'd administered psilocybin-assisted therapy to cancer patients, and the results were really compelling. We'd never seen anything like it, to be honest, and this was sort of really only after 1 or 2 sessions in combination with therapy. So for me, that was quite an attractive, treatment proposition to, and I was convinced someone would bring it to Australia, but nobody did. So I start of 2018, I'd reached out to Prism and we'd started working towards a protocol to get something happening here for our patients.
Oh, you're being the change you want to see in the world. So, Matthew, can you talk, Matthew, about why it's taken so long for psychedelics to be looked at again for therapeutic use? What changed so that we're seeing this resurgence now?
Well, as we saw in the video, the research came to a stop in the early 70s, and it really took generations to pass before society was basically ready. I kind of think of it as the culture wasn't ready. There was the shock waves were so strong that no matter what anyone could have done back in those days, the time wasn't right. So basically, people had to retire, people had to die, new people had to, come in charge, decades later, to even consider this, and for people to take the chance for it not to be professional suicide in order to, whether they're going into a PhD, into medicine, to, make this a focus of their career. So, starting in the late 1990s, things started to ramp up with just a very small number of research groups around the world. And, some 20 years later, that has really exponentially increased. And so now we have really dozens of groups, most of which have started only within the last year or so. But there's a lot of interest worldwide. And there was the reinitiation. That's, the time had to pass for that reinitiation to happen. But it's been the results since that reinitiation that has just, attracted the additional research groups to it and has convinced the skeptical that, hey, this is at least worth continuing to research because we're seeing results for really tough to treat disorders like depression and addiction that are in many cases like multiple times larger in terms of the treatment effect size than you traditionally get. So it's really worthy of continued research.
So, Olivia, your research looks at human states of consciousness and what it means. What are your thoughts on the current push to reintroduce psychedelics as medicines?
Yeah, well, I think it's great that there's now some really concerted efforts to do good science behind the effects of these drugs. I mean, my interest as someone that's really trying to understand how the brain creates a conscious experience, I find these drugs extremely interesting because they clearly push the individual's experience into quite unique or extreme states, I'll say. And I think one thing, even stepping back from the clinical side, where people are known that if people with schizophrenia might have hallucinations or delusions, but most of my work is based on healthy humans. And I think it's often not really appreciated that all of our experience at any moment is a complete reconstruction in our mind. I mean, one example I often give, because it's the easiest to illustrate, is that we experience such a rich three-dimensional world always. And all of this is gained from a flat sort of retina that we have at the back of our eye. And our experience of colour and all the rest of it is the brain is processing this sensory data and creating this the internal sort of reality. And I'm interested in how the brain does that and what are the extremes and the breadth of experiences and internal realities that our biological brain is able to create. And so, I think these drugs are extremely interesting to addressing that question. But it also, I think, part of the question is, are there any concerns or positive sort of outcomes of this research, is to also better understand what are the factors that might lead to negative experiences or versus positive experiences. So really trying to unpack all of those things is what I'm interested in.
Just staying with the history for a moment, there was a lot of drug discovery and a lot of drugs used in psychology in the 60s and 70s. Paul, what is it about psychedelics that made them fall out of favour when other types of drugs have become very widely used?
Well, there are perhaps a few different ways to come at that. The video we saw at the beginning indicated, I think, the key elements of it, which were that, these drugs were associated with a set of kind of countercultural positions. Something interesting about the psychedelic experience is that it can make what is pervasive and therefore invisible in your experience alter and therefore become visible. And that includes, for example, cultural norms and the things that we kind of take for granted. And so, one of the storylines in this interesting historic arc in psychedelic medicine is the one that we saw there, where psychedelics escaped the lab, so to speak, or the clinic, and entered the public zeitgeist, primarily in the States, and was, I think, probably accurately associated by politicians with anti-war sentiment and anti-establishment sentiment. And so, there were political maneuvers, if you like, culminating in 71 with psychotropic acts and international treaties that scheduled these drugs in the most prohibitive way. And interestingly, at that time that happened, there was already a good 15 years prior to that of quite a lot of research, particularly in the States and also in Europe. In the States, the most prohibitive scheduling is based on a couple of factors. It's a bit different to our scheduling here in Australia. It's based on abuse potential and on known medical value. And the scheduling of the classical psychedelics was at that time they were put into a category where there was no known medical value and high abuse potential. And there was plenty of data at that time, 15 years worth of data. Granted, methodological limitations in that first wave of data, but there was enough data there to indicate that was not a scientifically or medically grounded set of decisions. It was a political maneuver. And there were even some admissions in later interviews with the people that were associated with Nixon's government and the kind of architects of the war on drugs, really admitting verbatim, the quote is, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Like, this was about associating certain subgroups with these compounds, making them illegal, and therefore finding a way to put those groups down and put them into prison and stamp out their voices. So I think that's one of the main stories. There are, of course, a whole set of other elements to why we saw this, 30-year period in the deep freeze, as Michael Pollan put it. And as Matt said, I think we're seeing now this resurgence in part because of a kind of cultural and generational shift, and in part because it's likely that somebody's going to get through and start doing some research. And then if you can do that research, then the data is reasonably compelling. So that snowballs.
Well, let's talk about that data and that research, because scientists are by their nature students of history, but also learning to follow the data. And so given that this class of drug was loved and maligned both in the 60s and 70s, let's talk about what's driven the revival. Matthew, can you tell us about some of the clinical trials and studies that you've been involved in up till now?
Yeah, so one area of research is the treatment of the psychological distress experienced by serious cancer patients. And so this is actually the most advanced stage of clinical research with classic psychedelics, and this is with psilocybin, which is from the mushroom. There's been 3 randomized, double-blind, controlled trials with this, basically seeing if if one or a couple of sessions with psilocybin can decrease depression and anxiety in these people that are really facing fear of death and all of the horrors that can come with that psychologically. And the results have been astonishing. They have shown very large reductions. 6 months later, from a single high dose administration under supervised conditions, people being their suffering coming down into the non-clinically severe range, the range of the clinical scales suggesting they're not suffering from any psychiatric disorder anymore. And those seem to hold up. One set of colleagues did a follow-up about 5 years later and found that people were still substantially helped, that those symptoms were still substantially reduced. So another biggie is the treatment of depression outside of cancer. There have been a couple studies with psilocybin on that now. Our group has recently published the first randomized study of psilocybin for major depressive disorder, and again found very large effect and lasting effects. And then we get into the treatment of addictions, and the two that have been most prominent is the work we've done at Hopkins helping people quit tobacco smoking. And then also picking up on the older LSD work, there's been work using psilocybin to treat alcoholism. But those are at a bit of an earlier stage than the cancer work. I'm mostly completed a randomized larger trial, and the alcoholism work going on at NYU is at about the same stage. But so far the results look really compelling with very high success rates. And so those are the biggies, and it prompts the question, why is this working for these nominally distinct disorders? And I think one of the important scientific points that this line of research might lead us to is recognizing the commonalities across these disorders. And the way I kind of put it is these are all ways in which someone can be stuck, whether it's about a terminal illness, whether it's about self-persecutory thoughts as in depression, or whether it's with the use of a substance. And somehow these experiences can help people become unstuck.
Right. So actually, Olivia, can you talk to that? Like, what's actually happening in the brain when someone is, when a psychedelic substance is involved?
Yeah, sure. I think the most important thing to say up front is that there's still just a huge amount we don't know about the brain. We don't know the neural basis of consciousness. We're learning much more about things like the biological basis of depression, but there's still a lot that's not known. But what I think is really interesting about the psychedelics, and I think there might be some slides to show, is that we actually, in terms of the action of these drugs and the compounds and the structures of these drugs, we know a lot. So here you see just a sort of diagram of the chemical structures of the main psychedelic agents. So psilocin is the active metabolite in psilocybin, but just shown in comparing to the black structure, which is serotonin, which is the naturally occurring neurotransmitter in the brain. So we know the chemical structures of these compounds, and if you just flip to the next slide, we also know really a lot about the neurobiology of the serotonin system. Now, in this slide, you see in over on one side the serotonin pathways, and that they compare against the noradrenaline and dopamine and acetylcholine neurotransmitters, and these are the naturally occurring transmitters in the brain. And if we go to the next slide, what I think is really interesting and amazing actually about these compounds in terms of making them an attractive tool to investigate further is that not only do we know that it works through the serotonin system, and I showed that there's also a dopamine system and noradrenaline system, just to make the point that there is a lot of different chemical pathways in the brain. And not only do we know that these drugs activate the serotonin system, we know that they're pretty selectively activating the serotonin 2A receptor, and most of those actions can be attributed, most of the psychedelic effects can be attributed to the 2A receptor. And what I have on this slide, I always like to say, is that it's meant to be overwhelming, that it shows every serotonin receptor. There's a 20-odd serotonin receptors, and we know that this drug activates one of them, primarily acts through that, and we know where those receptors lie in the brain. We know what is the consequence of activation of those receptors at the cellular level. And I think it's interesting that it's this receptor. It's, there's 100 or so other receptors in the brain through different pathways and a whole stack of other, biological processes that are important in brain function. There's something very specific about activation of this receptor. And so that's not to say we now understand everything, but it gives the scientists a handle on, what are the low-level biological processes that are happening and how can we start to tie them onto biological changes that are associated with treatment and therapies.
So the therapy process isn't just sort of chucking some psychedelics at someone and then walking away. Margaret, can you talk about what the holistic process looks like?
Sure. So to begin with, we actually need to spend quite a bit of time screening people to see that they're safe enough to actually tolerate the treatment as well, because, excuse me, it would be remiss of us to sort of say this is for everyone. It's not for everyone. We know that psychedelics are not good for people, for example, who have a history of psychosis or bipolar, or even if they've got an immediate family member with these disorders or spectrums of those disorders. So we do spend quite a bit of time screening people and assessing them to make sure that they're safe for treatment. Then we move them, if they're eligible to sort of receive the treatment, we then move them into a preparatory phase of therapy where two therapists are with them throughout, where we get a good, developmental history of that person, a good story, a good narrative of their illness, of their life. And then we start talking to them and sort of preparing them for the day session as well. So things like, usual kind of effects of psilocybin and how to maybe meet the challenging experiences on psilocybin, which can actually, it's been called a bad trip, but sometimes actually it can be really therapeutically valuable if they can be worked through under supervision and with in the right setting. So we just spend a lot of time orienting them towards the therapy day. And the therapist day, the day itself, I think there's a little bit of footage of setting up the room, how we do this. And, there's a pill. That was our first one that we'd ever administered in Australia. So, yeah, it's not actually mushrooms. I think that's worthwhile saying as well. It's actually a synthetic version of psilocybin. So, yeah, we basically try and set up the room to be as comfortable as possible so that it's a really kind of a cozy and supportive environment where people can lay back. They're given eye shades. They're there for several hours with both therapists, and they listen to a set playlist of music with headphones on. And, yeah, so we basically make it as comfortable as possible to, really allow for their experience to take place in a supported way. And that day, actually, the therapists are actually quite hands-off. It's really about them, we direct their focus internally, and then they can, allow the psilocybin to sort of do its work. After that, we then do some more of the integration. And, because it's important to sort of say that, as Matt was talking about before, when people can get stuck, the way that psilocybin can really help therapeutically is that it can kind of relax our usual and rigid sort of modes of thinking. So they can really experience quite profound shifts in perspective. But also then it can occasion quite transcendent and spiritual experiences. And for somebody who's terminally ill, that can be extraordinarily powerful. So
You've worked in palliative care for years now. What's notable about psychedelics in that setting?
Well, I guess for the patient, it's obviously it's 8 hours rather than sitting down for 1 hour of say talking therapy in that way. But I think that the fact that you're moving them into a therapeutic space where it's an altered state of consciousness, we just seem to be able to access some of that stuckness, if you like, in a more powerful way. And it seems to be able to sort of, particularly with death anxiety, that's very visceral, and it's really quite, it can be quite arresting for people, and they can be really gripped by that. So it has a way of accessing that in a way that really other treatments are just seemingly unable to do. So I think, and when you've got somebody who's terminally unwell, they're very bounded by their sense of illness. They're very limited by, obviously their physical illness, but also psychologically, they can't do the things that they used to engage in. They can't engage in life in those ways. So, it's quite a powerful experience to then, offer them a space where they can experience quite expanded and transcendent states of mind, as well as, it's not just the reduction of the depression and anxiety that these studies have shown, but also the fact that they can really, access quite deeply spiritual and transcendent states.
Yeah, Paul, can you talk to that a bit? What's the common experience when you're under the influence of psychedelics, and what's happening in the brain that's informing this?
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing about psychedelic experience is that it's highly varied. People can experience all kinds of different things. And this relates to something that one of the pioneers in the first wave of psychedelic medicine said. Stan Groff referred to these substances as non-specific amplifiers. That is, whatever is latent or somewhat activated in what you're thinking about or what you're feeling or the environment around you will be magnified or exaggerated under classical psychedelics. I think that's part of the story, maybe half of the story. And then there are certainly some highly specific amplifications that occur that we can think about in terms of like common effects across majority of participants. I mean, the first thing to say, and the most obvious thing to say, is that classical psychedelics at the doses we deliver in these clinical trials produce dramatic altered states of consciousness. And these are for people who have not experienced a dramatic altered state of consciousness, it's a shocking or intense or very difficult to describe or anticipate. I mentioned before this basic idea that the things that are pervasive in our awareness are invisible, and that goes for what we think of as kind of subjectivity itself, or the backdrop onto which all your explicit processing, your thoughts and your feelings occur. So under psychedelics, this is a crucial thing. It's not just that your perception changes, which it does, or that the way you think or feel changes, which it does. It's that subjectivity itself, or technically primary consciousness or ipseity, there are lots of words for it, seems to alter. And interestingly, when it alters, you become aware of it for the first time. And that can be quite shocking to suddenly become aware of the backdrop of your life and your awareness that is somehow playing an invisible part in how you orient to your life and the decisions you make and what you feel. So that's happening. There's this dramatic altered state of consciousness for most people. And then within that, there are a set of common effects that people tend to report. And perhaps from a clinical perspective, some of the most relevant of those include what both Marg and Matt have touched on here, the ability to see familiar things as though through new eyes, the ability to take on new perspectives, whether that be in terms of the way you think about something or even what you can feel. And that can be quite fundamental. It can go all the way down to kind of, assumptions or beliefs that you've never even noticed in yourself, that are often there playing a part in psychopathology, like in depression. They're kind of paradigmatic beliefs about guilt or worth or these kinds of things. So you can get a new orientation on old problems, and there are a couple of there are many aspects to the psychedelic experience that are of relevance to the clinical application. But I think worth pointing out a couple of almost meta categories of experience, and that is that the kinds of experiences that people have in these clinical contexts, while people are aware that they are experiencing some forms of distortion, like the walls are bending and things are really distorted, there is some element of the psychedelic experience that has this intense reliability. what I'd refer to as verisimilitude, like it resembles reality. It's a little bit like waking up out of the dream of your life for a lot of people. And so it's not the sense of being, entirely under this distorted drug influence that is not trustworthy. In fact, there's something in it that feels more reliable than your sober state. And another interesting factor, which may relate to why we see sustained outcomes many, many months and years beyond the kind of immediate drug effects, is that these experiences that people attribute as reliable, new perspectives on their life or new perspectives on belief or whatever, seem to have this enduring authority over time. So it's not like like with many other drug experiences where after the fact you just, you put that down to the drug experience. What you believed it at the time, but now you realize you were stoned or whatever, and it's not reliable. In fact, there's an enduring authority of those experiences over time.
So that's really complex, right? Like that's a really complex thing that's happening in your brain. Just briefly, Paul, what are the risks associated with psychedelics then?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think the risks are often misunderstood. A lot of people in the general public have some sense of kind of chemo risks or drug-based risks, physiological risks. In fact, these substances, the classical psychedelics, are among the most inert substances you can ingest. They don't produce dependence. It's very hard to become addicted to them, and they're not toxic in your body. So the risks really are primarily within the psychological realm, and when these drugs are consumed in the wild, then there are some behavioral risks. People can do some silly things. Though again, the public perception on that kind of the frequency of that kind of risk is blown out of proportion. In general, it's an incredibly small proportion of people that do silly things under psychedelics. But the key risks in a clinical context are to do with having extremely confronting or difficult psychological experiences. And if that's not prepared for well or managed well, then that can cause some form of traumatization or re-traumatization. But, in the modern era, in the last couple of decades, these experiences, although challenging experiences, are very common for people in a clinical context. That's also what you would expect if you're going to do good psychotherapeutic work. It's going to hurt. But these processes have been managed incredibly well, and the frequency of adverse or serious adverse events in the modern era is negligible. But yeah, so the risks really are primarily around panic and traumatization. There are some more peripheral risks that I'm interested in, especially when we think about scaling this up into a mainstream form of therapy. There's some interesting ideas around exacerbating narcissism. There's some interesting ideas about exacerbating delusional-like thinking, but I think these are very, low-frequency risks.
So it's a bit early to sort of draw too many results from Margaret's trial in Melbourne, but there are early results from trials in the US and the UK and Europe. Matthew, what are we learning overall so far from these early clinical results?
Well, we know under the right conditions that have been studied that these psychedelics can lead to very large improvements for depression, for multiple types of addiction, and also suffering in people with cancer, that is to say the psychological suffering. And so this is remarkable not only for the variety of disorders that are treated, but also the magnitude of these reductions. But also, and this, I think this is really the paradigm shifting thing, it's the fact that it only takes one or a few administrations. This is not the standard psychiatric medication model where you typically, take the medication on a daily basis and it addresses the symptoms, hopefully, and so you just keep taking it. This is very different. It's not just the drug, because there is preparation for the experience, and there is what's called integration, which is essentially just discussion with the professionals afterwards about what the experience was like and about what it might mean for you going forward. But it's just remarkable that one, two, three administrations of a compound will lead to like large reductions in addictive behavior or depression or anxiety years later. And so, I think it's pointing us to why is that? It's because these are not directly and automatically treating those disorders. It's that it's the non-specific amplifier that Paul, concept that Paul mentioned. That's one way to think about it. There's a sort of a flexibility, a plasticity that's afforded. And that's also has the potential in a horrible context for, there is a history, it's rare, but you can brainwash people with these drugs. That appears to be what Charles Manson did, essentially brainwash people to commit murders. But this is, as in the video, the CIA was exploring those types of use, using these as interrogation agents, for example. But this general mechanism of making the person more flexible under the right therapeutic environment with the right intentions, it's a learning experience that's not there in normal psychiatric medicine. And when it works, someone learns from it like a big life experience, and then the change is self-perpetuating in many cases.
So, Olivia, how do you then separate the effect of the drug from the effect of the experience as a whole?
Yeah, look, I think that's one of the biggest remaining questions. In terms of the clinical efficacy, we need to do more trials. The early results are looking extremely impressive. But Paul made a point about the scaling up. At the moment there's small numbers, and we have people coming in for an 8-hour session in a lovely controlled environment. And I've done other research just for other completely unrelated research projects where the work has been done in psychiatric inpatient units, and the aesthetic in an average hospital environment couldn't be a million miles further from that type of environment, and the sessions with the psychotherapists or the psychiatrists are short. And so we do need to really, the scientific paradigm is perfectly well suited to remove one variable. What is the impact of the environment? What is the impact of the drug? We have a very clear, as I talked before, about the chemical structure, what is happening in the brain. We understand that, but is a huge amount going on that is the other side to these therapy sessions. And there's all in terms of the regulatory bodies and all of the government sort of infrastructure, I'll say, that keeps, I'll say, patients safe. In the past, in the 70s, we saw that the use of these drugs was shut down. But the question is all around, is this compound safe to be given to people? That's the question being asked. And how should it be regulated? Does it need to be stored in this way? And the implication of the current line of research and the way that not psychedelic medicine, the way that clinical sort of studies are done typically with pharmacology is that if it's deemed safe and to have an effect, then the compound itself is available. We need to do a much better job of understanding in what context these drugs are safe or harmful, and in for which people, and under what context. And I think it is also then becomes a question of scaling up. If it turns out that these drugs have amazing effects in a perfectly controlled environment with a very well-trained therapist over sustained long sessions, and then I just hope that we're able to provide those sorts of environments on a mass scale. And how do we control that the people are getting the drugs in the right environment is a huge question. I don't think that has been given enough thought. That all the focus is on this little chemical. And one, just to add to that, there is a number of recent discoveries and a lot of work being done from the pharmacology side to come up with compounds that activate the same receptors but don't induce the same psychedelic state. And I think that's another really interesting question. You know, clearly these drugs are impacting the brain. And is it about the impact, you know, at the biological level? Is it a combination of both? Is it the psychedelic state itself that is clear? So in terms of moving forward and developing good, the best therapies, we need to understand what is contributing to the therapy and what could make that session dangerous if it's removed.
Right, so there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of unknowns. And Paul, you're looking at a few facets of this. Can you talk a bit about your current research?
Yeah, so things are certainly, happening now in Australia after, a long pause. We finally are joining the conversation, spearheaded by Marg's trial. And then since then, there have been a few other trials that have been ethically approved and a few more in the pipelines. I work as an investigator across a number of trials in Australia, psychedelic trials in Australia. We are soon to start a psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat depression trial. It's a small trial, and we're going to begin the therapist training this month. We're also doing another small open-label trial in Sydney, psilocybin-assisted therapy to treat methamphetamine use disorder, and collaborating pretty closely with a few people in the States doing similar kinds of trials. And that's with Jonathan Brett and other collaborators on that trial. I'm also involved in a trial with Vince Polito at Macquarie, looking at microdosing and brain changes and psychological changes associated with microdosing. That trial is an interesting one in which we're getting participants to consume their own psychedelic in the wild under blinded, self-blinding conditions, and then come into the lab for scanning and various psychological testing. And then I'm in the process now of just establishing 2 new trials at Monash University. They're not yet ethically approved, but they're in advanced development. One is a MDMA to treat PTSD trial, with a lot of assistance from MAPS, the leading organization in that domain, and therapist training from MAPS. And another is a larger, well-controlled psilocybin to treat generalized anxiety disorder trial. That'll be the first in the world using psilocybin to treat a primary anxiety disorder. The research in the modern era has looked at anxiety symptoms associated with end-of-life illness. And so there's a whole host of trials, and there are other ones as well in the pipes. So Australia is definitely joining the conversation, which is exciting. There's a lot of work, of course, we need to do here, and a lot of schooling up we need to do here. And it's all possible on account of standing on the shoulders of giants overseas who have, come before us in this wave and the previous. And Matt is one of them. We really are pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, and it's only able to be done kind of ethically and responsibly and sensibly on account of the bridges that are being built to these overseas groups and the kinds of best practices they've already developed.
So, of course, Margaret, you're running one of these trials, one of these active trials here in Australia. Is it a double-edged sword when you're working with psychedelics? Like, people know what they are, there's a bit of understanding, but perhaps there's some misinformation and maybe even stigma involved in it?
Yeah, I mean, I think moving into it, we were prepared for that. I think we were mindful that how it could be received by the wider community, the academic community. We tend to be a fairly conservative, I think, academic landscape here in Australia. So I have to say we were a little bit worried about how it would be received, but it had, lots of warnings. It'll be a career killer, all that kind of thing, or I wouldn't be taken seriously. But I have to say we have not had that really at all. In fact, the response that we had was overwhelmingly positive. And I think obviously, Michael Pollan, I think, dropped his book in May of the same year that we submitted our ethics application. So that was really helpful. I think we're sort of on the back of, some medicinal cannabis. So there were things happening in the space already. And as Paul pointed out as well, we are standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. So, Matt's work at Johns Hopkins and NYU and, and now, Imperial College have really paved the way for us, and it made it easier. So it was a good time. I think obviously the media certainly helped us with creating a dialogue in the community about, our current state of treatments in psychiatry. And, but I guess also it is a little tricky. That's because it can exaggerate sometimes the benefits. I think sometimes people can come with perhaps unrealistic expectations about what this is just treatment panacea. I just have to lie back, get the psilocybin, and not completely. But you still can't bypass the fact that there's a lot of psychological work that needs to be, squared with and faced and worked through. So yeah, I think it's certainly. It has been a bit of a double-edged sword, but I think it's certainly been very, very positive, I think, as well for I guess that the overwhelming interest, and we have been and continue to be inundated with inquiries from people who are seeking treatment, from people who are researchers or students who are wanting to get into this space and understand it more. And I think that's a fairly useful metric as to how well the public sentiment is shifting in that way. And certainly the media has contributed significantly to that.
Paul, what is it going to take for psychedelic medicine to be regulated in Australia? Do you have an idea of what the timeline for that looks like?
Yes, something of an idea. So, firstly, we need adequate safety and efficacy data. There are many people in the space who think it's in the bag, as in we should just be changing, laws and regulating this medicine already. But actually, these drugs have not passed through the standard procedure all the way through yet. Any drug that gets listed in Australia on the ARTG and regulated by our regulator, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, needs to pass through a well-prescribed sequence of research processes, and we certainly, haven't done that. No drug in the world, no psychedelic in the world, or MDMA has gone through that yet. The drug that is, or the treatment, I should say, because this is not just a drug, in my view, is that's furthest along in that pathway is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD. MAPS is the organisation leading the charge in that, and they are just a little bit past the halfway mark on their phase 3 trial. And phase 3 is the final stage you need to go through in order to then apply to register and license the medicine. So, their timeline is they're probably a couple of years away from that point. As soon as it happens in a jurisdiction like the US, then it's likely to be able to happen in Australia, immediately thereafter. The Therapeutic Goods Administration accepts US data. The populations are similar enough. So we don't even have to do a local trial to make that happen. However, the local research is crucial for many reasons. I mean, firstly, there is not yet adequate safety and efficacy data, nor have we, we really are just coming through the birth canal in Australia in terms of this research program and understanding how to do this work well. And the global field of psychedelic research is in many ways reasonably young. There are all kinds of very compelling signals that suggest that this is likely to work for a subset of patients, but we don't know for whom it won't work, or we don't know how we can optimize the treatment to make it work for more or to make it work better. There are many basic questions, let alone the questions of therapeutic mechanism, how it works and how that can inform practice. And then, of course, as Matt indicated, this seems to have transdiagnostic effects. We seem to be able to use similar kinds of treatment approaches augmented by psychedelics to treat very different indications. And so that's what's happening now. We're seeing this kind of spread of application across different kinds of indications with new anorexia, nervosa trials, etc. So in Australia, the process will be that we get some group gets through the efficacy and safety steps that are required, whether it's in Australia or overseas, and then there's a set of regulatory processes, and then there are also important kind of professional body and cultural processes that I think are important. There's no use having something on a list of prescribable drugs if nobody prescribes them, or if barely anybody prescribes them, or if prescribers are prescribing poorly or are not adequately trained, etc. So we need to develop a kind of the capacity to do this work and an interest in doing this work. And so that is one of the functions of the local research. It's, in my view, the research environment is the only ethically viable and responsible way at this moment in time in Australia to train up the psychedelic therapists of the future, because we don't have, at this point in time, runs on the board or hardly any. And we don't have a precedent and a group of people that can adequately guide and chaperone the process of training in service delivery in Australia. The way we need to do it is very carefully within the trials and with a lot of support from people overseas who have been doing this work already. So I think that's one of the functions of the research here, is developing the capacity to do it well.
So let's look to the future. And you mentioned just now, Paul, about the fact that there are other conditions that are being looked at that might be good targets, or that psychedelics could be good targets for. Margaret, assuming everything goes well with your trial, are there other conditions that you'd like to try psychedelics for?
Me personally. In terms of, yes, as a researcher, where I'd like it to head, my personal interest would be to see if we could look at potentially offering this for people who are bereaved. Obviously, we see people and families who are just shattered after losing a loved one, and obviously that's normal for a period. But then there are some people who really just they're unable to rebuild. It's like a character's kind of torn out of their books, and I guess the work of mourning and grief is to sort of rewrite the chapters that follow. But a lot of people are really unable to do that, and they're very stuck, as Matt mentioned before, that stuckness. I think existential, the syndrome of grieving, I think may really hold a potential research opportunity for psilocybin, because again, it can access that existential ache in a way that I think that a lot of treatments currently fail to do, or don't do it as powerfully. So I guess for me, as a researcher, my personal hope is that it will move into that space, and I would like to see it move into that area as well.
Olivia, how about you? What's your vision for how you might see neuroscience and medicine merging?
Well, I think there's two things. I mean, this question of how the drugs, or how the biological and chemical processes that are impacted by these drugs really do support these unusual states of consciousness, and what is the relationship between neuron activity and our experience is just a massive scientific question. I think for me it's all about what are the components here, and so from the clinical side I think that's also extremely important. One nagging, I don't know if concern is the right word, but I think that the work being done at the moment is extremely promising, but I have this concern that if it moves forward in the current format, it won't be viable or accessible to enough people. It's extremely intensive. Everything has to be controlled, and it's hard. The mental health crisis we have at the moment is absolutely impacted by the lack of the right access to existing treatments, and existing good quality therapy. So I just think we need to be really mindful of that and trying, as we move forward, to look at what are the key elements, what can we make this slightly more refined, not to devalue that experience, but with the more you can sort of reduce it down to less elements, it's likely that it's going to be more accessible to other people, and similarly reduce potential risks, inadvertent risks.
Right, so the mental health accessibility thing is a real factor. But Matthew, what about other applications for these drugs, maybe outside of a mental health setting? Are there early signs that they could be useful?
Absolutely. In fact, the first work that we did at Johns Hopkins, going back almost 20 years ago, was in so-called healthy normals, which is science speak for people without a diagnosable mental health problem to treat. And so in that research, we did a couple early studies where we found that 6 months, a year later, that friends, coworkers, spouses would say this person is easier going, they're handling life better. People would make endorsements that their life was improved in any number of ways because of this. They highly valued those experiences, considering them touchstones in their life. We then moved on to doing some work with looking at interactions with meditation, found some interesting interactions there, like an enhancement in some domains. We've recently wrapped up some work, haven't published it yet. Given often the spiritual and sometimes even religious nature of the experiences some people can have, we've done some work with religious professionals. People have talked before about how this would, how these, from different faiths, religious professionals would react. Could it be used in training clergy? So, bit premature to share the results from that. We're still analyzing it, but stay tuned. But I'm going to be starting a study soon looking at effects on creativity and on people's professional lives. So many of these ideas come from these off-target examples you see in other studies where you come in to quit smoking, for example, but you find yourself reconnected to your career. Maybe sometimes you realize you were on the wrong path and you need to kind of recalibrate. So I'm very interested in these kind of questions about sort of modeling what so many people have, from Steve Jobs to Carrie Mullis, who invented PCR, which revolutionized medicine. And gosh, if you get into music, we could go on and on for days about the examples of people saying that psychedelics, transformed them for the better. So, getting into that stuff, yes, there are risks, which we've talked about, but under the right conditions, can we somehow maximize the positive and examine some of these effects in people without a disorder to treat?
A fascinating future is awaiting us, I suppose, but that's all we've got time for in this session. So thank you so much to all of our panel. We've got, thank you, Matthew Johnson, Paul Lignaitsky, Margaret Ross and Olivia Carter. And this has been Mind Altering Medicine's panel for the World Science Festival Brisbane 2021.
Come and discover the epic wonders, the friendly faces, and incredible new adventures that will change you and the way you see the world. Right here in Queensland.